The sea was rough and unwelcoming. Men huddled down, trying to keep out of the spray that lashed their faces. The misery of seasickness in their bellies was compounded by something else, the anxiety of what they were about to face.
Many of our troops became seasick. In what seemed like an eternity, we finally headed toward the beach.
Most of the platoon were singing.
In the half-light of dawn, it became clear that they were not alone.
One just looked and one couldn't believe the size of the operation. I mean, everywhere. There were boats of all description, destroyers, and, and aircraft were coming over too.
In the sky, shrouded in thick, low clouds, engines from hundreds of aircraft roared overhead, all heading in the same direction.
That's where you really grow up. Maybe in an hour's time, you're really facing something that you didn't expect to face even the week before that.
150 of us facing the might of the German army, and I thought, well, to do that even in the sort of best of conditions was going to be bad, and we were going to do a drop just after midnight.
It was June 6, 1944. By air and by sea, they streamed towards the coast of Normandy. This was the start of Operation Overlord.
The channel was full of boats coming towards the Normandy beaches. And the skipper said, "Look, boys, we're making history. This is D-Day."
Their mission was to secure a foothold on the north coast of France and pave the way for the liberation of Europe from Nazi occupation. In June 1940, the last remnants of the British Expeditionary Force and their French allies had been driven off the beaches of northern France and Dunkirk. Despite the defeat, there was a growing realization amongst the few allies left that ending the Second World War would mean landing powerful forces into German-occupied Western Europe. It took 4 long years of what Prime Minister Winston Churchill described in 1940 as blood, toil, tears, and sweat before the Allies could fulfill that objective.
December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
It was not until December 1941, following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, that the United States became fully committed to joining the war. With America's industrial might now on a war footing, the prospect of the end of the war began to look possible. It was not until May 1943, when President Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill met in Washington, that planning for an assault on the coast of northwestern France became the major priority for the Allies. They gave themselves a year to prepare. The successful invasion of French North Africa in November 1942 provided the Allies with a wealth of experience in combined operations that included putting troops and armor ashore from landing craft, as well as timed assaults by airborne troops and attacking aircraft. By the time the two leaders met again in Quebec in mid-August 1944, a draft plan was already in place. Codenamed Operation Overlord, it was a complex plan that would make use of air, land, and sea forces, sometimes working independently, other times together. The goal was to put a large enough force onto mainland Europe to bring the war to an end. failure would result in the war lasting many more years. Above all, preparations had to be conducted in great secrecy. In overall command was General Dwight D. Eisenhower. On his shoulders alone lay the responsibility of making the critical final decisions. It was a thankless task, made all the harder by the need to keep his sometimes fractious group of subordinate commanders in line. The planning for D-Day was a monumental undertaking, involving thousands of military personnel from multiple Allied nations. Maintaining secrecy was paramount. The success of D-Day relied heavily on the selection of the landing sites. The most obvious choice was the Pas de Calais, as it was the closest point between the continent and Great Britain. But it was exactly what the Germans expected, and so they had built up formidable defenses. After careful analysis, the beaches of Normandy were chosen for their relatively flat terrain and proximity to key objectives. Before mounting an amphibious assault, the Allies had to secure control of the skies. Without it, the invasion fleet would be vulnerable, as would any forces that succeeded in getting ashore. The U.S. 8th Air Force had been launching daylight attacks on German industry since the summer of 1942. The U.S. Air Force preferred launching its missions in daylight, as it was believed that the bombers could achieve greater accuracy. But it was costing the Air Force dearly in the lives of crews and aircraft.
Those 1030 upper or lower? B-17 out of control at 3 o'clock. Come on, you guys, get out of that plane. Bail out. There's one. He come out of the bomb bay. Yeah, I see him. There's a tail gunner coming out. Watch out for fighters.
It was a numbing experience, believe me.
Keep your eye
And
out.
you did a lot of praying that getting through this without being killed, that the plane would survive, that you would survive.
There's 3 more shoots. Flag, 11 o'clock. Fighters, 6 Heavy, 109 at 3 o'clock. Keep after him.
Despite repeated attacks by the 8th Air Force by day and the Royal Air Force by night, German defenses were as strong as ever. As well as running the gauntlet of the hundreds of flak guns that ringed the cities and industrial centers, the bomber crews faced attacks from the Luftwaffe's fighters.
Watch those 2 and 12, Van. They're coming in. They're coming in, Scotty. Get that ball turret on them.
American crews flying in daylight were especially vulnerable. Their fighter escorts did not have the range for raids deep into Germany. The bombers invariably were left to fend for themselves as swarms of fighters came up and picked the bombers off one by one.
When you come out of the flak and the fighters will be out there looking at you, first one they seen trailing fire or smoke or feathered engine, they'd go in after it. And I can well assure you they'd pretty well get them.
The losses were becoming unsustainable. A change in tactics was needed if the Allies were to achieve security for the invasion forces from aerial attack. At the beginning of January 1944, General Jimmy Doolittle took over command of the 8th Air Force. Priority was given to defeating the Luftwaffe. The bombers were tasked with destroying aircraft factories, airfields, and industries associated with aircraft production. The arrival in service of the North American P-51 Mustang meant that the bombers now had a fighter that could escort them to Germany and back. But instead of being expected to stay with the bomber formations at all times, the fighters were given the freedom to fly ahead and clear the skies of enemy aircraft. And if the German fighters declined to engage, then the Allied fighters were authorized to attack targets of opportunity, like freight trains or convoys.
All hell broke loose. So their armament was over around the middle of the amphitrome. And I could see these tracers coming up. And I knew I was going to get hit. I knew that I just felt it in my bones.
In February 1944, the U.S. Air Force and RAF conducted an all-out campaign against Germany's aviation industry and the Luftwaffe. Heavy bombers from the 8th and 15th Air Forces hammered aircraft, engine, and ball bearing plants by day, and RAF bombers attacked by night. Codenamed Operation Argument, it became known as Big Week. The escorting fighters played havoc with the German aircraft that came up to meet them. Over 4,000 sorties were flown, dropping around 20 million pounds of bombs. The cost was high. More than 200 heavy bombers were lost with about 2,600 casualties. But Big Week operations cost the Luftwaffe a third of its available fighter aircraft. More importantly, a fifth of the Luftwaffe's irreplaceable veteran fighter pilots were lost in combat. Aircraft could be replaced relatively quickly, but it took a lot longer to train pilots, and time was not on the side of the Germans. By May 1944, the strategic bombing campaign had crippled the Luftwaffe's fighter force, making the Normandy invasion possible. In the weeks before D-Day, Allied aircraft hit German troop concentrations, airfields, and transportation targets almost unhindered by the Luftwaffe. After D-Day, Allied aircraft continued their attacks to support the Allied breakout from the Normandy beachhead. Throughout the end of 1943 into the first months of 1944, Allied preparations for the Normandy landings continued to build up. It was widely known that there was going to be an invasion, but the timing and location were closely guarded secrets. Even the Germans knew that an invasion was coming, but could only guess at the location. In preparation, an enormous defense system called the Atlantic Wall was built by the Germans. Stretching over 2,400 miles from Norway to Spain, it was designed to prevent an Allied invasion of Europe. Construction of the Atlantic Wall began in 1942 under the direction of General Erwin Rommel, the famous Desert Fox, for his military successes in North Africa. The wall consisted of a series of bunkers, gun emplacements, and obstacles such as barbed wire and minefields. The defenses were strongest in the northern part of the wall, where the Germans expected the Allies to land. Here, the wall was fortified with concrete bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, and coastal batteries.
We expected the invasion to come that summer and waited for it with mixed feelings. I knew I had to do my duty as a soldier, but in my innermost heart, I just hoped for it to be over.
However, as the war progressed and the Allies gained air superiority, the wall became increasingly vulnerable to air attacks. Rommel and his staff were convinced that the Pas de Calais was where the Allied invasion would land, as it was the nearest point between England and the continent. Their belief was reinforced and fed by one of the greatest deception plans in history. Operation Fortitude was a strategic deception plan orchestrated by the Allies to mislead the German forces about the location and timing of the D-Day invasion. Allied leaders knew that the success of the invasion relied heavily on surprise and misdirection, so substantial resources were deployed to keep the Germans off balance. Under the command of British intelligence, Operation Fortitude was divided into two main components: Fortitude North and Fortitude South. Fortitude North aimed to convince the Germans that the Allies were planning to invade Norway, while Fortitude South sought to deceive them into believing the invasion would target the Pas-de-Calais region of France. Any German spies in England had long been rounded up and either imprisoned or turned to act as double agents. However, others were ready and willing to support the Allied war effort. Arguably the most successful of these was Juan Pujol Garcia, who was given the code name Garbo. Garcia was a Spanish businessman who, following his experiences during the Spanish Civil War, had developed a loathing of political extremism of all sorts. Undeterred, he created a false identity as a fanatically pro-Nazi official working for the Spanish government. In time, he was recruited by the Germans and instructed to move to Britain and build a network of agents. Instead, he moved to Lisbon and began building an entirely fictitious network of agents. Most of the information he was sending his German handlers came from newspapers, magazines, and cinema newsreels. The Germans' ability to disseminate intelligence was poorly organized, and soon Garcia became one of Germany's most trusted agents, spending substantial resources in following up on his information. Having chosen Normandy for the invasion, it was vital to convince the Germans that the Pas-de-Calais was the true location for the main attack, and that anything else was a diversionary tactic. Two fictitious armies were created to throw the Germans off balance. The Fourth Army was created in the north to suggest that an invasion might take place through Norway. But it was the creation of the First U.S. Army Group in the southeast, directly opposite the Calais region, that preoccupied German intelligence gathering. It was given greater credence when General George Patton was appointed as its commander. Patton was the Allied commander the Germans most respected following his successes in North Africa and Sicily. An entire command structure was created so that fake signal traffic could be generated. Detachments of troops were repeatedly marched to and from their barracks to Dover Harbor to create the impression of a large number of forces embarking on invasion barges.
We moved back into inland, into what was assumed a marshalling area, and then marched down to the coast. And some of the forward units went into barges to convince them it was a real thing. But we just went along, marched down the seafront, spun round and went back home.
Fields were filled with dummy tanks and aircraft and flimsy wooden landing craft moored up in rivers, all designed to look convincing enough to reconnaissance aircraft. All the while, Garbo fed his German controllers a stream of information, convincing them that the German 15th Army should remain in the Calais region. At other times, Garbo and other double agents fed blizzards of information designed to overwhelm and confuse their German controllers. Just before the invasion, Garbo was authorized to leak information that Normandy was the target. It was too late for the Germans to do anything about it, and it helped them believe Garbo's authenticity. The deception plan was executed with great ingenuity and imagination right up to D-Day itself. One of the more unusual deceptions was the use of an actor to impersonate General Montgomery, commander of the invasion land forces. Actor M.E. Clifton James bore a striking resemblance to the great man. By disguising him as Montgomery and sending him off to Gibraltar and North Africa, it was hoped that this would persuade the Germans to assume no invasion was imminent and may even be launched through the Mediterranean. All the services contributed to the deception plan. In the hours before the landings, Lancaster bombers from No. 617 Squadron, the legendary Dambusters, flew a special operation up and down the English Channel.
a series of loops working nearer and nearer to the coast. At the same time, we were dropping window in different sized bundles.
To the Germans monitoring their radar, it looked as if a large invasion force was approaching.
Airspeed, course, to rate of turn, everything had to be exact.
Joining the airborne forces who formed the vanguard of the assault were 500 dummies and bags filled with straw. They were dropped by parachute all over northern France to confuse the German defenders as to where the actual invasion was coming from. The deception operations were so successful that the Germans continued to keep forces back in the Calais region, including 2 armored divisions, for weeks after D-Day. They were so convinced that that was where the real invasion would land. The Germans held Garbo in such high esteem that they didn't recruit any other agents to corroborate his messages. They even awarded him the Iron Cross. Britain would later award him an OBE. The biggest challenge facing the Allies was how to get men ashore, and once ashore, how to ensure they could hold on to their slender foothold and begin their advance inland before German reinforcements arrived. The key to a successful outcome lay in using airborne troops. They were to land behind the beaches, seize critical bridges, and seal off the landing beaches. British paratroopers were also given the task of taking out one of the large coastal gun batteries that threatened the British beaches. The paratroopers were to be joined by infantry and gliders. The total strength of the airborne assault was around 18,000 men. The Americans decided that they would not use glider infantry in the initial assault, following too many training accidents. Instead, 2 divisions of paratroopers, the 101st and 82nd, were to be dropped at the most westerly end and behind the American beaches codenamed Omaha and Utah.
We spent most of our time out in the woods, living off of the land, and saw our camp rarely. We come in and take showers and get clean clothes and go again.
The training was intense in the weeks before D-Day, as they were going to be dropped at night. Also, many of the air crews had little or no experience of flying in formation at night, let alone under fire.
We pretty much knew what we were going to do. Didn't know exactly when, but knew what we were going to have to do. And there was quite a bit of anticipation for it, really. You know, it was like, let's get this damn thing started and get it over with.
Following the experience gained during the invasion of Sicily, when several Allied aircraft were mistakenly shot down by trigger-happy crews on ships, all invasion aircraft were painted with black and white stripes. By the end of May 1944, the 9th Troop Carrier Command, which was scheduled to ferry the paratroopers to Normandy, had over 1,200 Douglas C-47 Skytrain aircraft at its disposal.
It was incredible. All the way down the runway with these gliders with Dakotas hooked up to them. The usual American sort of flamboyance, and you know, they looked absolutely immaculate. And we joined these, and we were detailed to a glider, and just roughly said, just follow everybody else and take this glider out. And we didn't inform the American airborne troops that we'd never done it before. We thought that was prudent, you know, not to do that.
However, around 40% of the crews available were recent replacements and had not taken part in training for flying in formation at night. Also, nearly 3/4 of all the crews had no experience flying in combat conditions. The paratroopers were to be dropped at the western end of the Allied beaches behind Utah Beach so that the invading forces could seal off the Cherbourg Peninsula. If they succeeded, the Allies would have access to a large port. This would then provide facilities to unload fresh supplies and reinforcements as the campaign developed. It was to be a tough mission, as they were jumping at night and would be behind enemy lines for some hours before the beach landings. During the evening of June 5th, the heavily burdened airborne troops clambered aboard their aircraft and gliders.
We knew that we weren't all coming back, but we didn't know what to expect. We figured that our jump was going to be somewhat similar to the night jumps we'd made before. I don't think any of us considered the fact that we were going to be so widely scattered as we were in Normandy. I wasn't. I don't think anyone was.
On my airplane, it was a very quiet airplane. There was a lot of people I thought that were staying within themselves. And, I know I thought a lot about myself at that time rather than the guy sitting next to me.
Initially, the flights went well. According to plan, the aircraft headed out west and descended to 500 feet, well out of range from the invading fleet and below the German radar. But once over land, things started to go awry. Heavy flak and an inability to find their drop zones meant that many aircraft drifted off course. As a result, the paratroopers were dropped all over the countryside. Some were dropped too low, leading to leg injuries. Others were dropped too high, where they hung below their chutes for what seemed like an eternity, presenting easy targets for the defenders on the ground.
The Germans were shooting at us on the way down. To get my canister, my gas mask was on my side. I had left the gas mask in England and filled it with cigarettes. And they shot holes through that gas mask, and then I landed in the water, so I had no cigarettes.
Some of the area behind the beaches had also been deliberately flooded. Many men, heavily laden with additional equipment, landed in the waterlogged fields only to be pulled down into the depths and drowned.
We didn't get any equipment bundles because all of us that were there had landed in the river. In the floodwaters of the river, those who landed in the mainstream drowned. I was very fortunate. I landed in the floodwaters and it was only a little over waist deep.
Remarkably, despite the chaos, those that survived used their initiative to form small groups, which gradually found others to form meaningful fighting units.
We survived several severe firefights. We were behind the lines 5 days. We were finally pinned down in a field in the little town of Bouzeville, La Bastille. And by that time, our 52 had gone down to 39. We had lost 13 in the firefights. We had 2 wounded with us at that time. We took our wounded with us. If they were able to move at all, we took them.
Later in the day, an additional 4,000 men, consisting of glider infantry with supporting weapons, medical and signal units, were to arrive in 500 gliders to reinforce the paratroopers.
We sort of eventually reached a point where the glider left us, and when you looked down and saw these gliders landing, it looked pretty horrible, a bit of carnage there. There was many of them were overturned on the back and on the side and smashed up, and we thought how fortunate to be going back to our own base and leaving this behind.
While the Americans were fighting their way out of the marshes, British and Canadian airborne forces of the 6th Airborne Division landed behind Sword Beach, which was the most easterly of the invasion beaches. Their task was to seize and hold river crossings to prevent, or at least delay, German reinforcements getting through. The 6th Airborne Division had 2 parts, parachutists and glider-borne infantry. The British persevered with gliders, as they could carry more heavy equipment than the paratroopers. In the early hours of June 6th, the gliders and their tugs took off and headed directly south to the French coast.
when I first got into the glider, in fact, I mean, we sat around for quite a long time before that on the runway waiting to get on. I think all of us, we were getting extremely nervous. And I was getting very frightened, I don't mind telling you, because they told us that they were going to send 150 fighting men plus 30 Royal Engineers into capture these two bridges over the Caen Canal and the Orne River. And we thought, God, we're going to be in there, 150 of us, facing the might of the German army.
Unlike their American counterparts, they encountered no flak. The first airborne troops to land on French soil were 150 men of the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry. They landed in gliders at two vital bridges at Bénouville and Ranville, just to the north of the major city of Caen.
I honestly thought we must all be dead, because there was nothing happening. The glider sort of stopped. There had all this noise going on and all these sparks and everything else. Then suddenly there was dead silence.
The Caen Canal is a major transport artery that splits Normandy from north to south. Capturing the bridges would prevent the Germans from reaching the Allies as they established a bridgehead. Although they faced overwhelming odds, they had to hold on as best they could until the commandos fought their way through from Sword Beach to reinforce them.
We said, well, you know, we've had it. We've virtually run out of ammunition. We've got no more ammunition for the machine gun, virtually no more ammunition for the rifles. We've got no grenades left, and the Germans are in all the cotches across a few 40 or 50 yards away. And it was then that we suddenly heard the sound of this the commando bagpipes, the most weird thing that you ever imagined. You know, every one of us was English. And we thought, God, that sounds like heaven. You know, we suddenly heard these bagpipes playing. We said, it's the commandos have reached us from the beaches.
Meanwhile, the paratroopers fared less well. Strong winds meant that many were scattered all over the region. The force had been split, with the 9th Battalion assigned to attack a large gun emplacement at Merville. The gun battery formed part of what the Germans called their Atlantic Wall. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel of Afrika Korps fame had been appointed to oversee its completion, although by June 1944 there was still much to be done. He described this region of Normandy as the lock through which the invading troops would break through into France and consequently into Germany. Like other sites along the coast, the battery at Merville housed enormous guns. Not only did this battery present a threat to the eastern end of the landing beaches, but they also had the range to hit ships in the English Channel as they unloaded their troops. Allied planners were acutely aware and worried about the threat this posed and made it a priority target. In the weeks before D-Day, there had been repeated bombing raids on the German defenses, but they had failed to destroy the massive concrete emplacements at Merville, and so the paratroopers were assigned the task of silencing it. Although 600 paratroopers were assigned to the mission, only 150 or so managed to make the rendezvous in time. Despite missing much of their force, the paratroopers attacked through thick barbed wire and a minefield. They managed to capture the battery and partially disable the guns just long enough for the landings to take place. The rest of the 6th Airborne paratroopers were scattered across the area between Caen and the beaches. Some drowned in the flooded areas. Others gradually made their way to their intended rendezvous points as best they could.
And then the red light came on to warn us to be ready for parachuting, and then the green light, and the first man jumped. And then number 2 fell down in the doorway. He was only a little man. We were each carrying about 100 pounds weight of stuff on us, and it had to be lifted up, pushed out, and that delayed us a bit. And I was jumping number 16, and the man in front of me tried to get back in again. He said, I'm not hooked up. And I said, you are, and I pushed him out. Fortunately he was, and he landed all right. But it was absolute chaos, and we're very glad to get out. It'd be about nearly 3 hours after the drop. There were only 140 men at the rendezvous, and we thought all was lost.
Despite their difficulties, both American and British airborne forces achieved what they needed to do, enabling successful beach landings and subsequent breakout before significant German reinforcements could arrive. Dropping paratroops and using gliders to get soldiers behind enemy defenses was an innovative form of warfare. D-Day was to reveal many others. The disastrous Dieppe raid in August 1942 demonstrated the need for aerial cover and armored support to achieve a successful beach assault. The bombing campaign had secured aerial supremacy, as many fighters were brought back to Germany to provide defense. The attacks on the German aircraft industry were so successful that the Luftwaffe was barely visible in the countdown to D-Day. The landings were able to go ahead virtually unscathed by aerial attack. But landing infantry also needed armored support. How to get the tanks ashore required innovative thinking. The problem was handed to Major General Sir Percy Hobart, an eccentric British officer who envisioned a specialized fleet of vehicles tailored for specific tasks on the battlefield. These vehicles, equipped with unique attachments and modifications, played a crucial role in the success of the Allied forces during the invasion of Normandy in 1944. They became known as Hobart's funnies. Swimming tanks were arguably the most extraordinary invention. They were called DD tanks, which stood for duplex drive. A waterproof canvas screen that wrapped around the entire hull enabled the tank to float. A propeller and shaft attached to the tank's engine gave it propulsion. The idea was that the tanks could be launched from their landing craft offshore and then motor ashore with the infantry. Once on dry land, the screen was lowered so that the tank could be operated in a normal way. Numerous exercises were held to try out the concept, and it seemed to work.
More or less every day we were involved in the Solent area, landing on the Isle of Wight. No, we were pretty busy doing it. Of course, we had a lot of maintenance to do, in the sense that we had to keep the thing waterproof, which, a tear here and there had to be repaired, and in the hull itself, underneath.
But the weather on D-Day was rough. The British decided to bring the landing craft much closer to the shore.
I suppose it got a bit dangerous when you were in sort of 4-foot waves, because the area above the level of the sea and the top of the screen was probably only about a couple of feet. So that, if one in a swell, one started to roll, one only had to roll a little bit too far for the water to come over the top, and thus, make things rather dangerous from the point of view of staying afloat. The shell landed fairly close, and it wounded our second in command and one of my other tank commanders. And so, at that point, there was nothing one had to do. One had to go. So I went, not realizing, of course, that this shell had undermined me a bit. And we went into the water, and very soon, after about 50 or 60 yards, I knew things weren't right, because my drive was saying, water's coming in, what are we going to do? And so I said, well, bail out. There's no way we're going to get to shore with water rushing in at the rate it was rushing in.
Meanwhile, the Americans landing on Omaha Beach had run into problems. The first wave of tanks was launched from around 3 miles out into waves that were much higher than they had been in exercises. Of 29 tanks launched, 27 sank. The crews were able to warn the next wave so that they could be brought closer to the shore. But the delay meant that the infantry had to fight without armored support. One of the most iconic Hobart's funnies was the Churchill AVRE, armed with a powerful 290mm Petard mortar nicknamed the Flying Dustbin. This weapon was capable of demolishing enemy fortifications and clearing obstacles with unparalleled precision. It could also be fitted with a variety of attachments for engineering tasks, such as bridge laying and mine clearing. The AVRE was like a Swiss Army knife on tracks. Whatever obstacles stood in the way, the Allies had the tools to overcome it. Meanwhile, the Crab featured chains spinning on a drum, which proved invaluable for clearing paths through minefields, allowing troops to advance safely. Despite initial skepticism from some military leaders, Hobart's funnies proved their worth time and time again, contributing significantly to the success of the D-Day landings and the subsequent fight across Northwest Europe. Innovation played a critical role in D-Day's success. But once ashore, the Allies faced the challenge of how to get all the supplies they needed to continue the fight against the Germans. The answer was the Mulberry Harbor. The Mulberry Harbor was a massive engineering feat. The Allies constructed two artificial harbors, one in the British sector and one in the American sector off the Normandy coast. They solved the problem of providing temporary deep water jetties and a harbor until a French port could be captured and brought back into use after repair of the inevitable sabotage by German defenders. The harbors were made up of floating concrete caissons that were towed across the English Channel and sunk in place. Once in place, they were connected by floating roadways and piers to create a fully functioning harbor. Old ships were sunk to form a breakwater. The Mulberry Harbor was essential to the success of the D-Day landings. It allowed the Allies to bring in all the supplies they needed to continue the fight, including ammunition, fuel, and food. In fact, during the first 6 months of operation, the Mulberry Harbor enabled more than 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies to be brought ashore. The construction of the Mulberry Harbor was no easy feat. It required the work of thousands of people, including engineers, technicians, and laborers. They were built in a few months in great secrecy. The weather in the English Channel was often rough, and 2 weeks after the invasion, the Mulberry Harbor off Omaha Beach was partially destroyed in a storm. As it was considered beyond repair, the Americans resorted to unloading its cargoes and men directly onto the beach. Getting more than 150,000 troops ashore on 5 beaches on D-Day was an incredible achievement. Such an enormous undertaking was made possible by assembling an armada of over 7,000 ships and landing craft. It was called Operation Neptune. It took months to get all the different types of landing craft assembled in British harbors all along the south coast. As Britain had already committed most of its stock of landing craft to the invasions of Sicily and the Italian mainland, many had to be brought across the Atlantic from American shipyards. American yards were also working flat out, making the ships that would transport the troops across the channel.
Nothing was left to chance. Every loading operation was rehearsed and timed in advance.
Exercises were held all around the country to get the various units working together.
Daily they boarded their ships. For all they knew, they were bound for France or Belgium or wherever their commanders had decided to strike. 'Cause 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 'c
One particular exercise off Slapton Sands in Devon went badly wrong. During a large-scale simulation for the landing on Utah Beach, landing craft loaded with American armored vehicles and engineers were waiting to land on the beach. At the time, American and British signaling equipment used different frequencies, and so the landing craft were virtually unprotected due to a breakdown in communications. German E-boats managed to slip across the channel and get among the fleet. Around 750 men lost their lives in the ensuing raid, including 10 officers with detailed knowledge of the invasion plan. Eisenhower was so concerned that they might have been taken prisoner that he considered canceling the invasion and was only satisfied once their bodies were found. Despite the setback, the last weeks before D-Day saw a huge buildup of men and military hardware all over the south of England. However, difficulties in assembling all the landing craft needed forced a decision to postpone the landings until June 5th, when the next most favorable tides and moon would be available.
Again, was continually picking up troops and landing them, because it was no mean feat to get that craft, squared onto the beach and other people alongside it at the same time.
In the last days of May, camps were sealed. No one was allowed in or out. Briefings began as to the tasks they were expected to perform, although there was still no indication as to the location.
We went into marshalling yards, I think about the 2nd. And at that time, you were inside of a compound, really, and MPs all over the place where you couldn't get out, couldn't make any phone calls, couldn't do anything. So you were isolated in there. But it was a time of a lot more training, because they had people walking around with German uniforms and German weapons and getting you acclimated to what you were going to see and what you did hit the ground. And a lot of sand training tables. And so it was kind of hard work.
Finally, on May 31st, embarkation began. It was planned to take up to 5 days. But as the loading continued in fine weather over the next few days, a major problem was brewing out in the Atlantic. It looked like a storm could be heading for the invasion fleet, making landing conditions too dangerous.
Well, it was fine, actually, that particular day. I mean, it was June the 4th, and it was quite a sunny day. And so we were told, we're embarking this evening. And it was a nice evening, and so we duly, reversed up the ramp. I was the last to get on because I was going to be at the sharp end, if you see what I mean. And we just went aboard, quite comfortably. And then, of course, the weather broke.
Tense discussions followed between Eisenhower and his subordinates, to go or not to go. Stormy conditions offered obvious problems, but to delay risked word leaking out and losing the vital element of surprise. In the early hours of June 4th, Eisenhower decided to postpone the invasion by 24 hours. Many ships were already at sea, which meant they had to be recalled. Others had to bide their time off the English coast in rough seas.
It was so bad that it was postponed. So we couldn't go back in the harbour again then, for whatever reason. But I think the lads we had on board wish we could have done, because we tootled up and down the channel all Sunday night, all day Sunday, and the weather was atrocious. It really was bad. And you felt, you know, you really felt so sorry for them. They were lads who had never experienced it. And out of the 200, I would imagine 198 were sick, you know. And they weren't sick just for half an hour. They were sick all night and all day. That's why they went off so fast when we landed on the beach. They were glad to get off.
Finally, on the morning of June 5th, Eisenhower's chief meteorologist, Group Captain James Stagg, assured him that there was a window of calmer weather passing through. He predicted there would be a 36-hour window of good enough weather for the naval and airborne operations to take place.
On actual D-Day itself, we were told to go and patrol this part of Normandy at certain roads and to be on the lookout for transports moving towards the coast. We were not told it was D-Day because in case somebody was shot down and shot his mouth off before the actual troops landed. But we knew, obviously, it was going to be.
The order was given. On the morning of June 5th, the mighty fleet of ships that made up Operation Neptune, the naval component of Overlord, was on its way. It was the largest amphibious landing ever undertaken up to that date.
We were just surrounded by hundreds and hundreds. When you set off, we were surrounded by hundreds. We were passing through them. You wouldn't have thought you could pass through them. We were amazed as to looking at the number of ships we were passing.
When daylight came on the 6th, I mean, I could look back and there was this mass of shipping behind us. I mean, we were in front, obviously. And one just looked and one couldn't believe the size of the operation. Everywhere. There were boats of all description, destroyers, and aircraft were coming over too. One felt we were a pretty hefty force.
Well, when dawn came up, I couldn't believe my eyes. Everywhere I looked, from 0 degrees to 360 degrees, all I could see were ships. LCTs, LSTs, destroyers, cruisers, battleships. And overhead, the sky was almost black with the planes going over. B-17s, all kinds of different planes, some fighters, and again you could see the blinking V for victory. It was something that I will always remember.
And as we approached the channel, the skipper said, "Look at this, D-Day has been done." And I looked, and there was the channel, full of boats, and all coming in one direction. The channel was full of boats coming towards Normandy beaches. And the skipper said, "Look, boys, we're making history. This is D-Day." We saw at a bird's eye view of the beginning of D-Day.
Although the bad weather had eased, the sea was still rough, which made the crossing even more miserable for the troops.
My particular unit boarded the landing craft about 4:45 a.m. and joined the other 6 or 7 boats of our section. We were scheduled to hit the beach in the second wave at 7 a.m. in an area of Omaha called Easy Red. The sea was rough as our landing craft continued to circle. Many of our troops became seasick. In what seemed like an eternity, we finally headed toward the beach. I was standing near the front of the landing craft next to a captain from Division Artillery had a pair of field glasses trying to observe what had happened to the first wave.
By this time we'd come in close. We couldn't launch at what we were supposed to launch, i.e. about 5,000 yards. I mean, by this time we'd come into about 700 yards because the sea was, so rough. So that I got a fairly good look at the beach and what was going on. And there was quite a lot going on, which made me feel, we were going to take some stick. And indeed we did.
Despite the intense bombing and naval gunfire, the Germans were still able to mount stiff resistance.
Everybody's firing at everybody, you know. The Warspite was behind her, and he was firing over our heads. And you could near feel it was a 16-inch shell. You know, if you're near it, you know it's firing. And you could near feel them going over your head. Behind us then were rocket ships, which were those damn things, and they were the worst out because there's no certainty of where they're going to go, you know.
I can tell you that my throat went dry, painfully dry, and my hands began to shake. I wasn't the only man to be affected that way. One of the very young lads began to retch as if he was going to be sick. I could feel the blasts which made my ears ring and my nose bleed. I could see the large bunker behind us. One of the rockets struck it and simply blew the bunker to pieces. The walls and roof all flew apart.
As we were running in, then we were coming under fire then. There was everything was opening up on you. And we weren't allowed to fire back. And yet everyone was, you know, it was just hellish.
Well, I was the first off. By this time, you know, the ramp was going down, wasn't quite tight, so that took a little time to sort of rectify. And at that moment, a shell landed fairly close. Wounded our second in command and one of my other tank commanders. And so, you know, at that point, there was nothing I had to do. I had to go. So I went, not realizing, of course, that this shell had undermined me a bit. And we went into the water, and very soon, after about 50 or 60 yards, I knew things weren't right, because my driver was saying, water's coming in. What are we going to do? And so I said, well, bail out. There's no way we're going to get to shore with water rushing in at the rate it was rushing in.
When we got hit, we were probably about 100 yards from beach. So, and unfortunately, the shell blew up in the troop space, and all the men were up on the deck, ready for going down the ramps.
As we approached the last few hundred yards, we began to draw intense small arms fire, as well as mortar and artillery fire from a couple of well-concealed bunkers. The ramp finally was lowered, and we began to evacuate as quickly as possible into waist-deep water. Almost immediately, we began to suffer casualties from the severe small arms fire. We had at least 100 yards to go before getting to the sandy beach area, and at least 200 yards of sand to reach the cover of the rock and shale bank. All along the way, we were trying to keep the seasick and walking wounded moving, as we felt it was sure death to remain in the water. About 30 of troops in my boat reached the safety of the shale bank, many of them wounded, some others so sick and exhausted they could hardly function.
American attempts to land more troops ashore were hampered by an unusually high tide, which began to cover many of the defensive obstacles built by the Germans. Having lost much of their armor, the infantry struggled ashore to find what little shelter there was behind a low seawall and shale bank.
But now was not the time to think of right or wrong, only survival. After the first few moments had passed, my mind became automated. My mind rationalized. This was fun. When the gun jammed, I would clear it quickly, because every second counted. Even so, it left a sour taste in my mouth.
As the troops on Omaha struggled for survival, the U.S. Rangers began scaling the cliff at the western edge of the beach. Their objective was to silence a coastal battery which could threaten the Allied ships. Having reached the summit, they found that the Germans had withdrawn the guns further inland. Along all 5 beaches used for the Allied landing, the troops had to fight hard to secure their positions as they moved off the beaches towards their planned objectives. They were hindered by landing craft, struggling to get ashore by an unusually high tide caused by the stormy weather of the previous days. Slowly but surely, the defenders were overcome, and advances were made, some further inland than others. By the end of the day on June 6th, the Allies had the slenderest of toeholds on France's northern coast. The Battle of Normandy had begun, and with it, the liberation of Western Europe from Nazi rule.